Welcome back to Harbour Unboxed. It's Q&A time, February. We just answer questions. Honestly, there's been that much happening. I forgot we even did the Q&A series. Tim's like, hey, you want me to come over and do the Q&A series? And I was like, what's that again?
Yeah.
So,
and we're smashing into this. I arrived like 5 minutes ago, so it's busy times. Let's get into it.
Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their new Duranaut High Performance Thermal Paste. Duranaut offers extreme long-term stability combined with outstanding thermal conductivity, and this has been achieved through a specially engineered silicon oil combined with aluminium microparticles and zinc oxide nanoparticles of various shapes. Duranaut isn't electrically conductive and won't harden over time. For best performance, you'll want to apply a very thin layer, and to help with this, included is the TG Spatula Pro. The spatula's revised design allows for increased pressure during application, making it easy to spread a thin, even layer of Duranaut. So for more information, please check the link in the video description. Alright, Tim, will generational GPU performance become better again, or are we doomed? Oh, please no. Please lie if you don't think we've seen the worst. Oh, I'll be lying. I've been lying to myself for weeks now.
Right. I mean, there's no indication that I can see why we couldn't get better gains from the current hardware that we're getting. Mm-hmm. Because, for example, the 5090 is about 25 to 30% faster than the 4090. So that's not that bad of a generational gain. It's just that, at least from what we've seen from the 5080, not really applying to that product. And certainly there's the price to performance issues with both the 5080 and the 5090.
Yeah, it's a brute force gain though, isn't it?
I guess so, but the last time that we got a node shrink going from, was it Samsung 8nm for the 30 series to TSMC 5, was it a 5nm product?
Well, they're 5nm.
40 series. That gave us quite a substantial performance improvement. There was some power increase as well for a lot of the products, but what was the 4090, like 50+% faster than the 3090?
Than the 3090, yeah, probably more like 60% I would say. It's probably a good.
So that's pretty good.
That's good, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, we're probably not in the era of seeing that every single generation anymore, but I don't see why a GPU has to be 25% faster for 25% more money. Like, there's some margin there, there's some room.
Yeah, there's more to it than just outright the performance gain. Obviously, if you're buying the flagship tier product, then the financial side of things, the value isn't something you worry about as much. So you probably do care about the performance gains. But then at that, the sort of the pointy end, if you're getting 20% more, people seem happy with that. Like, you know, for example, the 4090 to the 5090, a lot of people interested in the 5090 seem quite happy with the performance gain, despite the fact that they're also paying more money for it. But yeah, it's the 5080s, the 5070s, for example, where the cost per frame becomes more relevant. And there are ways, again, to improve that by reducing prices, which means that you're not necessarily going to upgrade from one generation to the next. But if you're coming from a 3070, then the 5070 could be quite appealing, you know, with the right price and VRAM and all that sort of stuff.
What's one of the easier ways they could have improved some of those products is just giving you more, like, there's no limitation on VRAM. Like, you could just add more chips. It's more costly to do so, but it's not like they're running into silicon limitations preventing the 5070 from being a 16 or 24 gigabyte GPU. So immediately that product could be a lot more compelling and a lot more, you know, at least on face value, good, if they made that sort of change. And that has nothing to do with more of the silicon limitation side of things. There's potentially areas like that where, yeah, they could do a little bit more than they're currently doing.
I mean, short answer is no. And I think we're not stuck here. We're not going to see this sort of stagnation where, you know, 5% more performance for 5% more power or whatever it may be. There's more advanced, you know, manufacturing processes to come, and that will result in performance gains, and obviously they'll refine and make architectural improvements and stuff like that. So
that's a big one. It seems like Blackwell doesn't really have any architectural improvements.
Yep. So
they've claimed some, but
yeah, you're not going to see massive gen-on-gen performance gains anymore. We haven't always seen that anyway historically, but I think, yeah, more modest gains will be seen, but we'll still be seeing performance gains. So, you know, 10 years down the track from now, I'm sure what we have today is going to look very bad.
Yeah.
All right, similar sort of question here. Have we really hit the silicon limit, or do you think this is Nvidia doing Intel quad cores gatekeeping? I don't think it's that at all, and I don't think Intel did that for funsies. Like, it wasn't a choice; they were just struggling with their own manufacturing process, which is, I suppose, in a way, what we're starting to see some evidence of with TSMC. Though I'm not suggesting it's anything like that. But yeah, basically, I think while it's certainly getting more difficult to achieve any kind of performance improvement, I still think things are going to move on quite considerably from where we are at this point in time. It's just at a slower rate, which is tends to be how things happen when they get more difficult.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's not like the TSMC 4N node that's being used for this product is the end of nodes.
No.
There is still going to be many more process nodes to come. What gains we got on that, maybe not as significant as some previous generations, but there's been some pretty big gains directly delivered from node advancements over the years. But there's definitely a roadmap for many more node enhancements, and they're planning pretty significant changes to the way the transistors are actually made. So not just small tweaks, but backside power delivery and that sort of thing, which is pretty significant. But I mean, the last time that we saw a GPU generation like this on the same node was, I think, at least for Nvidia, going as far back as the 700 series to 900 series, which were both TSMC 28 nanometer parts, I believe. Those were a closer time difference between the two compared to what we saw this time with 40 series to 50 series being over 2 years. Back then it was, I think, less than 18 months maybe. We can fact check that, but it was pretty close.
If you're talking like 780 Ti to 980 Ti, it was about 18 months.
Yeah.
But if you go like the sort of the non-TI models, probably closer to 12 months.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was a shorter period of time anyway.
Yeah, that's right. So a lot of, if you've been following the GPU market for maybe the last decade, for example, you're probably used to a new generation improving the architecture, the VRAM, and also the process node. But these days, as has been alluded to basically by this question, you're not going to see as quick node advancements. Like, the development of the nodes is slowing. So that means there are going to be some generations where it just may not align with a new node. And that's basically appears to be what's happened with this generation. So it's unfortunate. They've tried to sort of, as you said in the previous question, brute force some gains. But ultimately, I don't think this is going to be the end of gains or anything, or they can't go any further. On node shrinks, they in fact usually go backwards in the GPU size. And that's pretty typical. They make a new node, they get a fairly similar node, so they make the GPU die size larger, and then the next gen comes around, they're like, oh, we don't need to make it 750 square millimeters this time, we can make it a little smaller, and that can reset the cycle a little bit. So it'd be interesting to see what happens for the next gen, but I would be shocked if it was on TSMC 4N again. There's just no way that's happening.
No. Crystal ball time. Are you ready, Tim? We didn't bring the crystal ball, have you?
No, it's still at my place, I think.
Ooh, I'm not sure how accurately we'll better answer this question. Do you think AMD will ever try to compete at the top end of the GPU market again, or will the 1700 XTX remain the peak for AMD GPU performance? Could you imagine that if the 1700 XTX was like, that was it? You go 20 years into the future, it's like, damn, that 1700 XTX is...
They're only making $50 GPUs at that point because they've never advanced.
I'm not sure how extreme you meant that question to be, whether you meant like reasonably short term. We haven't been able to benchmark the new Radeon GPUs, and even if we had, obviously that information would be embargoed, so we couldn't, But RDNA 4 is meant to only be pretty similar, from what we've heard, to the Radeon 7000 series RDNA 3. Cannot confirm or deny that at this point in time.
I think AMD's basically confirmed in some of their slides that that's the case.
Yeah, well, I haven't tested it, so
that's true.
Cannot confirm nor deny that stuff at this point in time. Obviously, March will have that information for you. But I quite confidently say that they will compete again at the high end. Again, I can't guarantee that, but odds are they will be. So I expect them to compete at the high end again. They're obviously working on designs, architectures that will be very competitive in the future. At least that's the goal and the hope. But it's all highly speculative. I mean,
Yeah. I think this generation shows the misstep of maybe not aiming for a high-end product, because the gains at the high end from Blackwell have been fairly underwhelming. So that's always going to throw up the question of, well, what if AMD this generation actually did make a high-end GPU? Like, if they were expecting the 5090 to be 50% faster. So they're like, oh, we're probably not going to be able to compete with a product that's 50% faster than a 4090. But then it turns out to be only 25% faster, and they've already cancelled that GPU. Was that a misstep? I guess we'll never really know because we're never going to see what that product is going to look like. But
at the end of the day, we will be better equipped to answer that question once 9070 comes out. You'll know where that lands, how that performs, and how a bigger version of that might have scaled. So it's a tough question to answer right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it always makes sense to go for that flagship Halo product. There's always the marketing advantage you get from having a high-end GPU, and Nvidia has been in that position for so many years now that they've benefited in pretty much every generation from always having that fastest card. So there's always going to be an advantage for shooting for that if they possibly can, and if they can get there, then they're going to get that Halo marketing advantage. So it'd be pretty silly to be able to make a high-end card but then not do it. So
well, they had the 4090s there, and maybe with the corrections they've made with RDNA 4, that was kind of a stretch to match that level of performance, and it wasn't going to be cost effective.
Yeah.
So they already had some target that was ahead of where they currently were. I don't know. How does Nvidia make money when they send all their GPUs to reviewers? So I guess this is a supply, demand, availability type question.
The first thing I want to know is how many 5090s does Hardware Unboxed have right now? Because I've got one. I've got a Founders Edition. How many do you have? You've got a Founders Edition as well.
I think I've got about 6 in total.
6?
Yeah.
So we know that there are some retailers that got like 3 or 4 5090s. So I guess that puts Hardware Unboxed as maybe a mid-tier distributor.
To be fair, it's only one of each model. So it's not 4 of the same model.
But it seems like some retailers got 0 of some models.
Yeah. Well, for example, MSI, they privately couriered mine out because they wanted. Basically, they knew no one else was going to get one to us in time, and because the embargo for the AIB OC cards is the day after the FE card.
Yeah.
And I told them, if you get it to us in time, we'll have to use your card because it'll be the only one we have. So they expressed that to Australia, and then one of their employees drove it out to me so I could test the card. And actually got 2 out to me. So basically, supply was so tight that AIBs couldn't even get reviewers' cards in time, which I think when that embargo lifted, there was a couple of reviews globally of AIB cards, like partner cards, because just no one had them. So supply is just terrible.
And to be clear, that is not usual for GPU reviews. Normally, by the time that an AIB embargo, sometimes they don't even have an AIB embargo, but usually they would have gotten the cards to us well ahead of time.
About a week in advance, yeah.
Yeah, especially because with this launch, the GPUs were announced about a month before availability, so that makes it a little bit even more unusual. And with the 5090, the embargoes were like a week before the
I think a month
retail
out,
date.
the partners didn't even have the GPUs. So all the cards you saw at CES, for example, were just dummy cards. So if you're thinking, oh no, that can't be right, I saw 5090s at CES, they were just dummy cards. There was no GPU on those cards, or it might have been like a defective GPU from the 40 series or something that they'd sold it on there, not sure.
Some sort of dummy die to sort of give them dimensions and stuff like that to produce a card from.
Yeah, but it wasn't actually the real die. So yeah, a month out, they didn't even have the dies to put on cards. So the cards that you're buying are very freshly baked. They've been just put together very recently. So pretty weird situation.
The question I want to know from you is, why are there no 5090s? Like, why can't you go into a retailer right now? Like, what? It seems like a GPU that a lot of people would want. Like, even though it's not the most amazing generation, but it's a high-end card. There's demand for it, and they're selling it for this big $2,000 price. Why can't you just go into a retailer and buy one right now?
Well, I have no idea. Is that helpful? We could theorize as to why that is, but I don't know. I haven't. I've got no real inside information on why that is the situation.
Because it seems like, based on what we've seen from some retailer leaks and also our discussions with the retailers, there's a lot more 5080s than 5090s. Like, there'll be 10 times the stock of 5080s available. Whereas, I guess, at face value, you'd probably think more people would want a 5090 than a 5080, just based on reviews, the Halo product kind of thing. And it seems like they're prioritizing the lower model, which seems pretty pretty unusual. It doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I can only do like conspiracy type theories for you on that one. Like, are they using the 5090 to create that brand hype to then go on and sell 5080s? Are they doing that because they can produce more 5080s than they can 5090s, yields and whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, that is a possibility. The 5080 die size is about half that of a 5090. So, and the price is about half as well. So that scales pretty well. But then in addition to that, because the die is smaller, yields will be better. So I think when I was doing some die size calculations for our recent Is the 5080 5070 video, the numbers made out that you could probably get from one wafer more than double the amount of 5080 die. So if you're making, let's say, 50 5090s on a wafer, I think the actual number was more like 40, you could get 110, 120 5080s from that same die, assuming the same sort of yields for the dies and everything. In which case, then, theoretically, from a wafer, you could actually make more 5080s than 5090s. But then, is the dollar margin going to be better on a 5090 because it's $2,000 versus $1,000, and the actual silicon cost is only a very small component of that? Like, even a 5090 is probably only costing between $300 and $400 for the GPU silicon itself. So that's one potential angle, but
Well, it's
a theory at least.
Well, it's a fact. So they can make many more 5080s than they can 5090s.
Yes.
So that is a fact. It doesn't necessarily explain what we're seeing, but it is a fact. So other theories could be that they're artificially limiting 5090 supply and drip feeding them out to maintain the demand and high prices of that product, because it would look pretty bad if they'd flooded the market with 5090s, sort of the same degree as 5080s, but then they just sat on shelves and it was kind of exposed the fact that people didn't really want them. And it's like a psychology thing. If you can't buy a 5090, but you're kind of thinking, should I get a 5090 or a 5080? And then you're like, I really would like to get a 5090. Just that, wanting it but can't necessarily have it drives up demand.
And drives up the price, theoretically. I mean, you see how many AIBs that are trying to charge $2,500, $2,800 US for their Supreme Edition versions. Whereas if you could readily buy them at $2,000, then is there a lot of value in a $2,800 model if you could just go out and buy a Founders Edition card for $2,000?
That's why those models have never made sense. So, again, we're not saying that this is happening. I have no evidence that that's what's happening, but it's a somewhat plausible theory.
And the final theory, I guess, is that the 5090 die is potentially more valuable in another use case. So probably not a server card or anything, but they have made, RTX, was it like RTX 6000? They used to be called Quadro cards, but they got rid of that brand. It's now
so workstation or something, productivity type product.
But yeah, like a workstation card. Obviously, the 4090 was highly sought after, not just for gaming, but your AI workloads, your workstation workloads. And if you can't get a 5090 or 4090, then the next option would be those workstation GPUs, which typically sell for like $5,000, $6,000 US. So if you can instead use all the 5090 dies you've made for a future upcoming workstation card, like you just stockpile them somewhere, then you could potentially make more money off them. But
yet to be seen, but it's definitely a possibility.
When it comes to these sorts of decisions, like why can't you buy a product that on face value would seem highly sought after, the reason is probably it's financially beneficial to the company in some way to not sell you that product.
Yeah.
So we'll see. But it's all just a theory. We really don't have an idea at the moment. Will AMD ever be able to apply the same price to performance success they had with Ryzen to their Radeon division? If so, do you all believe this will be, will it be this GPU generation or the next GPU generation or sometime in the future?
Oh, God. Well, I'm not sure about this generation. We're not too far away from finding out how that's going to play out. Next generation, with AMD Radeon, it's always been this generation or next generation. And I mean, remember when Vega was meant to be or, I don't know. I don't know what to tell you guys on that one. Whether we'll see the same success with Radeon that we did with Ryzen. Again, time and time again, we feel like we should have, and there was ways in which they could have pulled that off, but they haven't managed to. So, and with Ryzen, they didn't have anywhere near the fastest product. I mean, we've talked about this time and time again. They just had a product that worked well enough, and it was very, very competitively priced. And they've sort of done that. Radeon's almost managed to do that. You know, RX 480, 580, 5700 XT. They're not quite at the same level, but realistically, all they need to do is make a relatively affordable GPU, I would have thought. Doesn't have to be a flagship GPU, because they were never able to do that with the CPUs. It just has to be so affordable that the vast majority of people looking at buying a graphics card are just like, I can't not buy this. It's offering similar performance to this tier Nvidia product for, you know, a massive discount, 30%, 40% cheaper. Whether or not they can do that, I don't know. But they did it with CPUs. Like, they were throwing away 8-core CPUs for just over $100, while Intel was charging 2-3 times that for 4 and 6-core CPUs.
I think there's a couple of extra factors that go into it, comparing like CPU success versus GPU success. The first one is going back to the Intel situation. There were different nodes at play. So Intel were basically forced to make their CPUs on their own process nodes, which were kind of struggling at the time, whereas AMD was able to benefit from TSMC's rapid advancements relative to Intel. Because if we look back at like 2010, for example, Intel nodes were far ahead of TSMC in terms of their quality, and yet that stumble for a little while there, which allowed TSMC to catch up and even outperform Intel's nodes. AMD benefited a lot from that, whereas on the GPU side, both Nvidia and AMD are effectively accessing the same node, so they're not going to get as much of that advantage. And then the second thing as well is that a CPU is a much simpler product. So with the CPU, it's really just about performance. That's it. Like single thread, multi-thread performance. With GPUs these days, there's a lot of the software side of things that goes into it as well. Like Ryzen didn't have to compete with the DLSS type feature from Intel. It was just the performance. That's all they really needed to do. Whereas with Radeon, it's about the performance, but then also the software side of things, the drivers, all sorts of different aspects.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. And what you're saying is valid, okay? But it's only part of the picture. So with the software, you know, people were saying Ryzen sucks because it's unstable. The BIOS support's not as good.
Sure.
The motherboards suck, and the list goes on. And also, they weren't competitive in terms of performance anyway.
Yeah, well, the performance is the most important thing, right? You've got to get that price to performance down first.
Even like first gen Ryzen, you know, the Zen Plus update, Zen 2, they were all competitive given the price, but they weren't up there in terms of top tier performance. So again, I'm not disagreeing with you, but I think while that's a factor, I think, in my opinion, a larger factor is just the mismanagement, the mishandling, the failing of these launches. You can't have a product like the 7900 XT, which is a very important product. I'm certain we heard stuff like they had significantly more 7900 XTs to sell than they did 7900 XTXs.
Yeah.
So the 7900 XT was a key product for them. They were very concerned about it at launch. They really needed that one to go well. I ended up re-reviewing it 6 or 7 months after release, and it had improved by 20% in terms of cost per frame. That's a new generation of GPU. So just let that sink in. The 7900 XT at launch, 6 months later, was offering 20% better value. Start there, guys. Like, that's insane.
Yeah, like when I'm bringing up things like the features, there's obviously a value position that makes people not really concerned about the software side of things. Yeah. I think it probably means that price to performance, they probably have to price it a little bit lower if their features aren't competitive, whereas if there was no software to be concerned about at all, you would just make sure the price to performance is key.
Yeah, and even then, it's somewhat irrelevant. While they're all relevant factors, we've already seen that with like the 7900 XTX was 20% better value in terms of cost per frame than the RTX 4080, which we thought was a particularly poor product, and it didn't sell. And even today, it's still with the pricing discounts compared to the 4080 Super, they maintained that 20% margin with the same product.
And that's not a Ryzen margin. Ryzen was much more affordable than that.
Well, it doesn't matter. The point is, it hasn't worked. 20% is not enough to sell Radeon GPUs because they tried it for a whole generation and evidently didn't sell enough of them. So anyway, there's multiple factors there for why they haven't been competitive. Whether there's enough room there to be competitive, I mean,
they lowered the price of the 7900 XT by 20%. You were saying,
yeah.
So it's BS that there's no room for that. There was just that AMD couldn't come to us and say there was no room for us to make the 7900 XT cheaper. That's just BS. They made it cheaper in 6 months. And so it's factually wrong.
And the problem is the hype around people still in their minds, Gamers Nexus, Harvard Unboxed, pick a review outlet. I don't think there was too many that were terribly favorable towards the 7900 XT. So you get 6 months down the track, and people still have that, they feel quite negatively towards the 7900 XT.
Yeah, people don't care about a re-review.
It was not a well-received product. Well, it's not even that they don't care, it's just that we did a re-review. How many people did a re-review? I think 300,000 people to this day have watched the re-review. And even then, a lot of those people probably already made their purchasing decision and made their purchase, so they were just watching it out of interest. But they needed to launch with that price. It needed to be that 20% better value upon release. And then I think, it definitely would have been much better received. I think a lot of reviewers would have been saying, forget about, the 4070 Ti or whatever, just get this, GPU much faster, more VRAM. Yeah, the ray tracing is not as good, but there's very few good ray tracing titles anyway, so it's not worth paying a massive premium for those games, and so on and so forth. I just think it would have been much better received. I mean, it just makes sense that it would have been.
Well, that's what Ryzen did, right? Like, it launched with a good price and then it got better, even better than that over time. Products like the 1800X, they weren't amazing because I think that was a $500 US CPU at launch or $400.
Yeah, there was the 1700
was really good value. The 6-core models were very competitive in price because, again, at the time, Intel was selling you like 4-core, 4-thread models for the same money or even more money. And then they repeated that for at least 2 to 3 more generations by continuing to deliver like a really compelling $200 CPU. And then making that CPU like $100 in a year. So
yeah, I mean, with the CPUs, they essentially made the really well priced part, like the Ryzen 7 1700, and they had the 1700X, which was not as good than the 1800X, which was really bad, but they were the same part. So it'd be like launching the 7900 XT and then the 7900, which is just the non-X version, which is downclocked by 5%. But that's the $750 model, and the other one's the dumb $900 model. And then the uninformed people maybe buy the dumb model, and then that gets pretty negative reviews. But all the reviews focus on the 7900. That gets glowing reviews. Buy this, that's the one to get. So I don't know if that's a strategy. I mean, I'm not necessarily recommending that. I think just make a good product and make it at the right price. But we've talked about this heaps in the past. We've pretty much been saying the same stuff. And AMD's been doing the same stuff.
Yeah.
And it's just like, we've been saying they should do this. They don't do this. Same outcome. So we'll see what they do in like a month.
Yep. Okay, pretty straightforward question here. What are the ideal prices for the 5080 and 5090 to make sense?
We'll start with the 5080 because 5090... I think it makes sense at $2,000. I mean, the answer would be $1,600 at the same price, at least from a review perspective, because you're getting the extra 27% performance on average for the same price. So it's like, okay, that's okay. But I mean,
they'll sell at $2,000.
They're selling at $2,000 for what the limited supply they've got. So I guess from a business sense, that makes sense.
I think we said in one Q&A they could sell them for $3,000. So
whoops. Yeah, shouldn't have.
Well, that's probably still true.
Yeah. I'm just saying.
Right, so 5080.
5080. Again, ignoring how well they may or may not be selling, I'm under the impression that the stock that's out there selling quite well. So you could argue that the price that they're set at is the right price. But from a reviewer's perspective, what I think gamers should be happy with, what gamers should be getting, is getting more in line with the 3080 MSRP. So that was $700 back in the day. Adjusting for inflation, that's like $850 US now. So if the 5080 was $850 US, that would make it 25% better value than the 4080 Super.
Yeah.
And I think a 25% value improvement, although the performance isn't massively improved for those that have been holding out, because you sort of skip a generation these days. So if you did have a 3080, then you're getting the extra VRAM, extra performance.
It's like 60% plus faster than a 3080 for what you're saying is the same inflation-adjusted price.
Yep.
After 4 years, a little more than 4 years.
Yeah, I think it's actually just a little bit more now. Yeah.
Yeah, because it was launched like September or October of 2020. So that would encourage a lot of people to upgrade. That'd be
a really good upgrade. Yeah.
Get out there, get it. And I think in the 5080 is a 5070 review, at least video. I was talking about between 800 and 900. I think was like 800 probably. The sort of reasonable.
Yeah, so, 850 is in line with the original MSRP, and I think $700 for that product was really good at the time and has proven to be a good price point for the 3080. So, yeah.
With RDNA 4 confirmed to launch in March by AMD, how does this impact their ability to make a good impression on gamers when Nvidia has such a head start?
Well, Nvidia doesn't have a head start. That's the problem.
Well, they don't now. I think they've burnt a head start if they had one.
Well, for the products that are meant to be relevant, they don't have a head start. That's the whole thing.
Yes,
like I may or may not have a pile of new Radeon GPUs sitting over here, so they're ready to go. We're just waiting on drivers, obviously, for the reviews and the review embargo to be up. But the cards are out. The strategy clearly is to wait for Nvidia to do their thing, and then hopefully counter with something that's considerably better value. So but again, that's the sort of 5070 Ti, 5070 products. So they're waiting for those to be launched. Reviews will be what they're going to be. They'll probably suggest waiting to see what the Radeon GPUs do when they launch shortly after. And then hopefully they're a lot better.
Yeah, and I think on top of that, if anything, with the way that Blackwell has gone so far with the 5090 and 5080, that waiting is probably the better move because they've, this question talks about like Nvidia having a head start. Whilst like in the minds of a lot of gamers, the sentiment we're seeing in comments and things is that they've kind of botched the generation. Like there's a lot of negative sentiment about what's been released so far. Very underwhelming gains. People talking about the 5090 being like the worst generational leap at the high end in a long time, right? So with that framing, did they really let Nvidia have a head start? Like they did because the cards launched first.
But they're not even countering those cards.
Yeah, but I think it's kind of like the framing of this question suggests that Nvidia would have had this positive head start. People are getting hyped about Blackwell, like we're going to be really hyped about the 5070. But I think a lot of that hype is now diminished because of what people have seen from the current products. So AMD sort of sitting back and waiting for all of this to play out, I think is proving to be even more in their favor compared to when they made that decision, because they announced that the cards were going to be delayed to March before we started to see these reviews. And I think if anything, the reviews have sort of cemented why they should have done that. And like we sort of said on Twitter/X, all that matters is AMD. What is the response that AMD has to NVIDIA? People are always going to be comparing the AMD card to the NVIDIA card. How much better is it than the NVIDIA card? There's not too many people going, how much better is this than a 7800 XT? Like, I'm really keen on comparing AMD versus AMD. It's like most people are going to be going to the store or Newegg or whatever and going, this is what the 5070 offers. What's the counter to that? And so by having all the information, they can see the launch, the performance, how good DLSS 4 is, stuff that they probably wouldn't have been able to see prior to launch, and coming up with the right strategy. Whether or not they do that is, of course, another question. But
so far, this is the right strategy. Where they fully execute on the strategy correctly is yet to be seen. But so far, they've made the right move. Going to hit pause there on part 1 of the Q&A series. Good to have some different questions to answer. I just wish it was a little more positive. Exciting.
Yeah.
Enjoyable.
Yeah.
I love my job. Anyway, subscribe for part 2 because I'm sure there'll be more.
You're selling it super well.
I don't know. I don't know what to do anymore, Tim.
Yeah.
Maybe talk about multi-frame generation or something for a bit.
What do you want me to say about multi?
All right, thanks for watching, guys. I'm your host, Steve.
I'm your host, Tim.
See you next time.